the town that tried to outlast the plains in the spring of 1888. The town of Black River looked like a place where the future had already arrived. It stood on the northern rim of the grazing country, where the long grasslands began to break into folds of earth, ravines, and low stone ridges, as if the plains themselves were tiring of their own vastness. For most of the people who lived there, the railroad was still new enough to feel miraculous. It had reached Black River 2 years earlier, and in that short time it had done more than bring goods and passengers. It had rewritten the language of the place. Before the rails, men spoke about weather, creeks, bunchgrass, distance, and luck. After the rails, they spoke about carloads, market timing, Eastern capital, winter feed, interest payments, and the price of beef in Chicago. The town was young, but it already carried itself with the self-importance of an old city. It had a bank with a brick front and a brass handle polished every morning by the porter. It had a hotel with 24 rooms, a dining hall, and a piano no one played well but everyone admired. It had a saloon with a mirror along the back wall so large it made the room look twice as prosperous as it really was. It had a land office, a church with a steeple too ambitious for so small a place, and a warehouse filled with coils of barbed wire stacked nearly to the rafters. All of it stood under a sky so broad that a man could begin his day feeling bold and end it feeling judged. On fine evenings, when the sunset spread red and copper over the western edge of the world, Black River seemed less like a town than a declaration. The streets were still raw, the boardwalks still uneven, the mud after rain still deep enough to trap a wagon wheel, but no one took those things as signs of weakness. They were signs of becoming. The place smelled of cut lumber, leather, manure, coal smoke, and possibility. Men newly arrived from Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and New York walked its streets with the same expression prospectors once wore in gold camps, that look of hunger disguised as confidence that the hunger had a simple object: land. Not land for beauty, and not land for belonging, but land for use, for conversion, for ownership backed by paper and wire and guns if necessary. The old drovers used to say the range had to be read with the eyes. You rode it and learned where the grass thickened, where the water held, where storms liked to gather, where snow drifted, where a herd could winter, where it would die. The new owners preferred another method. They read the country from ledgers and maps. They wanted lines, boundaries, acre counts, carrying capacity estimates, projected yields, seasonal margins. To them the plains were not a living place full of moods and risks. They were a system waiting to be organized. The strongest believer in that system was Walter Haynes, manager of the Northern Prairie Livestock Company. Haynes had come west from St. Louis with a narrow face, a clean beard, and the composed manner of a man who had long ago trained himself never to appear uncertain in front of subordinates. He dressed better than most men in Black River, but not so well that he looked ridiculous. He knew how to speak to investors in the East and cowboys in the yard, and he took pride in the fact that he could translate one world into the other. He did not drink much. He did not gamble recklessly. He did not shout unless he had decided shouting would serve a purpose. Those who liked him called him disciplined. Those who disliked him called him cold. Both were right. He was not, in any ordinary sense, a cruel man. He did not enjoy suffering. He was not one of those frontier tyrants who bullied weaker men or treated every disagreement as a challenge to be answered with a fist or a revolver. But he possessed a trait that often proved more dangerous than obvious cruelty. He believed in order so deeply that he mistook whatever resisted it for ignorance. When Haynes looked out over the range, he did not see grass under weather. He saw variables: loss rates, transport distance, feed conversion, seasonal exposure, labor inefficiencies, underused acreage. He believed the same thing many ambitious men of that era believed: that the West had been wild only because no one competent had managed it properly. Among the riders working for Northern Prairie was a man named Jonas Creed. Creed was older than most of the hands in camp, though no one seemed able to say exactly how old. Time on the plains did strange things to faces. It carved 30-year-olds into men of 50 and left some 60-year-olds looking merely weathered. Creed had a narrow frame and hands that seemed made of dried cord. His skin had the dark, cracked look of wood left too long in sun and wind. He talked rarely, laughed seldom, and spent just enough money in town to keep himself supplied. He disliked arguments, but that did not mean he avoided them. It meant that when he finally chose to speak, others had learned to pay attention. He had driven cattle north in the years before the fences spread. He remembered the last wide herds of antelope and the old scars where buffalo had once passed in numbers beyond counting. He remembered river crossings that took whole days and night watches where a man slept in fragments and rode half dreaming. He remembered what the range was like when movement was the only law that mattered. That did not make him sentimental. He had seen too much hardship for sentimentality, but it had taught him something the newer owners had not yet learned. On the plains, anything that stops movement had to justify itself every winter. One warm day in June, after a ride that took him through 3 separate company pastures, Creed stood in the shade beside the stock pens and told Haynes what he thought. Too many cattle, he said, and too little open country left to save them if the season turns. Haynes, who had been reading a shipping report, folded the paper carefully before answering. We are not living in the old days, Mr. Creed. No, Creed said. That's plain enough. Then you understand that open country is waste, unless it is controlled. Creed looked beyond him toward the warehouse where the wire was kept. Waste, he said, is what men call any space they haven't learned to need yet. Haynes smiled the way educated men smile at sayings they find rustic but usable. We know exactly what we need, he replied. What we need is efficiency. Creed did not answer that at once. He watched a line of wagons at the depot where new posts were being unloaded. He watched a rider trying to bring in a restless string of remuda horses from the South Meadow. Only then did he say, very quietly, winter can make a fool of efficiency. The conversation was repeated later in town and laughed over in the saloon. Men in growing towns often laugh at warnings, especially when the warnings interfere with expansion. There was good money in Black River that summer. New money, fast money, the kind that makes men impatient with caution because caution sounds too much like delay. The summer itself gave signs, but signs do not matter much in places where men have already committed themselves to optimism. June was hot but not generous. The grass came up unevenly. The low country near the creek bottoms looked healthy enough, but on higher ground the bunchgrass never reached the thickness it should have. By late June the ridges already showed pale patches where the roots had not held moisture. July brought long strings of wind from the southwest. Not storm wind, dry wind, restless wind, the kind that strips the night's dampness before sunrise and leaves the mornings clearer than they ought to be. The small creeks shrank, mud banks widened, the edges of ponds cracked in a pattern like old pottery glaze. Several older stockmen remarked that the country was being grazed too close for the season they were having, but the companies had reasons for not reducing their herds. Some had borrowed heavily against autumn prices, others had contracts to fill. Still others feared that any public admission of trouble would invite competitors to buy land or water rights around them. Nearly all believed the same thing in one form or another, that they could hold on a little longer, carry the herds through, and recover with the next turn in the market. The plains have buried more than one fortune under the phrase a little longer. In August the anxiety deepened. The cattle began drifting harder to the water sources. Riders had to push them off trampled creek banks again and again. The grass close to the tanks and streams went first, then the grass farther out, until whole pastures had the look of hair clipped too close. Horses tired more quickly on long circles. Dust rose where there should have been none. A ranch woman living north of town told her neighbors that even the birds sounded different at dawn, sharper and less numerous. Someone else claimed the jackrabbits were moving east in unusual numbers. A freighter passing through said he had never seen beavers in such a hurry to build. The men at the saloon dismissed all of this as frontier superstition, yet many of the same men began unconsciously doing things their fathers had done in bad years. They checked harness more often. They rode fence lines longer. They watched the northern horizon at sundown. One or two even bought feed hay early, though not enough to matter if the winter came hard. By September, the color of the country had changed. From a distance the range still looked broad and usable, but the green had gone out of it. The plains turned the color of old rope and lionhide. At sunset the sky often took on a coppery haze, and around the sun there sometimes hung a pale ring that made even cheerful men go quiet for a minute before laughing it off. At Northern Prairie headquarters, Haynes was still sending reassuring letters east. He wrote of temporary dryness, manageable conditions, strategic fencing advantages, and the prudence of maintaining stock numbers in anticipation of favorable prices. He believed what he wrote. That was part of the problem. Men who knowingly lie can sometimes change course when reality intrudes. Men who believe their own optimism often continue straight toward disaster because turning aside would require them to admit not just a mistake, but a defect in judgment. In October the first real cold came at night. Not the ordinary autumn chill, but abrupt drops in temperature that hardened shallow puddles before midnight and silvered the low grasses with white by dawn. Then, by noon, the heat returned and the frost vanished as if it had been imagined. These swings repeated themselves in a way that unsettled the stock. Herds were jumpier at sunset. Several riders remarked that the cattle seemed to be listening for something. The first snow arrived in early November. It was light and gentle and almost charming. The town woke under a clean brightness. Children shouted along the border. The roofs of Black River shone in the sun. For a day or two, people admired the season and congratulated themselves that at least moisture had finally come. Men who have lived through hard winters distrust beautiful first snows. They know such snow can be a greeting, but it can also be a mask. The real storm came a week later. It announced itself first by silence. That was what several people remembered afterward. The sudden lack of ordinary sound in the hour before it hit. The hammering from the blacksmith shop seemed to carry strangely. Dogs stopped barking. Horses in the livery turned their heads north and held them there. By noon, the sky had flattened into a hard gray lid. By 1 o'clock, wind was striking the town from the open country with such force that loose signs slammed and telegraph lines began to sing. Then the snow came, not downward but sideways. It came in fine, cutting grains that found every opening in coats and walls. It came with such speed that a man crossing the street could lose the outline of the building he had just left. Wagons abandoned near the station vanished axle-deep before evening. The depot lamps became weak yellow stains in moving white. By dusk, Black River no longer seemed like a town at all, but a handful of structures under siege by a force too large to comprehend. South of town, the cattle began to drift. This was what cattle do under stress in a northern storm. They turn their backs to the wind and move with it, seeking lower ground, shelter, thinner snow, any advantage the land may offer. On an unfenced range they might travel many miles in that way. They might find a draw, a belt of brush, a south-facing slope, a river bottom where the feed remained accessible. But the range around Black River was no longer open. It had been improved. The first riders who went out after the herds reported only bunching. The cattle were crowding along the wire, pressing in the direction the storm wanted them to go. By the second day, bunching had become packing. The animals at the front hit the fence and turned back into the bodies behind them. The animals behind, blind with snow and pressure, kept driving forward. Some fell, others climbed over the fallen. Those that reached the wire were cut across muzzles and throats. The storm packed snow into the mass and around it until the whole thing became a living drift. Creed rode west with 4 men and a pair of cutting tools to open the line in one of the largest lower pastures. Getting there took nearly 3 hours over a distance that would have required less than 1 in good weather. Horses slipped and lurched on the forming crust beneath the fresh snow. More than once the riders had to dismount and lead them. The wind made speaking nearly useless. Snow struck exposed skin like thrown shot. When they finally reached the fence, the sight stopped even Creed for a moment. The cattle had built themselves into a wall. Dark backs, rolling eyes, white breath, horn tips, blood on wire, the shapes of fallen animals already being covered until they seemed to merge with the ground. Every few seconds the pressure from behind surged, and the whole mass shivered. There was no order left in it, no herd sense, only panic without room. "Cut it," Creed shouted, though the storm almost took the words away. One of the younger cowboys, Mason Pike, swung down and fumbled for the cutters. His gloves were already wet. The metal handles stuck to his grip as if alive. It took him too long to start. Creed seized the tool from him and found his own fingers no steadier. When the first strand snapped, the recoil nearly whipped the cutters out of his hand. They cut a second, then a third. By then the opening was enough. The front of the packed herd lurched and exploded through the gap with a violence so sudden that Pike was knocked sideways, and one horse reared nearly over backward. Through hundreds did not. There are rescues on the plains that men remember proudly and rescues they remember with shame, because they reveal the scale of what could not be saved. That afternoon Creed knew they had performed the second kind. The first storm lasted 2 full days. The third morning dawned windless and bright in the bitter way of post-storm mornings. Black River emerged from itself cautiously. Men dug out porches, doors, stock pens, depot steps. The bank reopened its doors by noon, though only a few customers came. In the offices of the stock companies, losses were estimated and translated into language fit for telegrams: unpleasant, substantial, regrettable, manageable. Haynes used the last word more than once. He told Eastern investors that the storm had caused concentration losses along several fence lines, but that the company's overall position remained stable. He believed this partly because he had to, and partly because the true alternative was not yet emotionally available to him. To understand that the whole structure of the operation might be flawed would have required him to distrust the thing on which he had built his authority. The weather did not give him long. Late in November another storm came, then another in early December. They were not all equally violent, but they were cumulative. That is how winter defeats large enterprises, not always by one dramatic blow, but by repeated subtraction. Feed disappears, flesh disappears, margin disappears, confidence disappears. Every storm takes something, and eventually what remains is only the shell of a system that looked robust on paper. Then came the Chinook. The warm wind swept in from the west so suddenly that within a day, roof snow was sliding off in sheets, and the streets of Black River turned to black mud. Men laughed in relief. Horses stood with lowered heads in the sun. Water ran from eaves and down wagon ruts. In town there was actual smiling for the first time in weeks. Some took the thaw as proof that the season had broken open and the worst was behind them. Creed did not smile. He rode back from the south allotments late that afternoon and saw the snow going soft under the weak sun. At the yard gate he met Haynes and said, "Only, if this freezes tonight, you'll wish the storm had stayed snow." It froze. The temperature plunged after dark with such suddenness that puddles hardened before midnight and the softened surface of the range locked into a glassy crust. By morning the open country had become a trap. A fresh snowfall covered the ice, disguising it. The cattle could smell grass beneath but could no longer reach it. Every attempt to break through with their hooves cost them strength and often blood. Horses fared little better. Several went down with split fetlocks and shoulders bruised from falls against hidden ridges. That change from snow over ground to snow over ice altered the mathematics of survival. It is one thing for cattle to face cold, while feed remains accessible. It is another for them to starve in sight of it. The losses from that point forward were not merely weather losses. They were structural. Calves weakened first, then old cows, then the young stock. Even the big fleshy bulls began to stand dull-eyed and still, conserving energy they no longer possessed. Frost gathered on backs and muzzles, hair roughened, spine ridges sharpened. In sheltered spots some animals simply stopped moving and stayed where they were until the snow shaped itself around them. By late December Black River had developed a strained atmosphere of a place trying not to admit it is afraid. The bank became more cautious with extensions. The merchants began to ask about payment dates with an edge in their voices. Ranch owners who had spent the summer boasting now fell into abrupt, unfriendly silences when the subject of herd counts came up. Men argued over water rights, over who had overgrazed which section, over whether the small farmers had worsened the trouble by fencing creek approaches, over whether the companies had brought in too many outside cattle the previous year. Each accusation contained some truth, but truth divided among many men behaves a lot like guilt. It loses the power to change anything. The railroad continued to run, though irregularly. In January it brought hay too little and too late in relation to the scale of the problem. 2 freight cars of hay and 1 of grain arrived after days of delay, and their unloading at the depot had the feel of a public humiliation. Here was the proud infrastructure on which so many plans had depended, and here too was the evidence of its limits. No railroad, however modern, could outrun a region-wide shortage once the season had already broken the stock. Still, the hay had to be distributed. Men stood around the freight cars with papers in gloved hands and desperation under their self-control. Northern Prairie had prior contracts. Smaller ranchers had urgent need. A widow whose husband had died the previous year came to town hoping to secure enough for her milk cows and was turned away with a gentleness that made the refusal worse. Nobody shouted. Nobody drew a gun. Yet the tension on that platform was heavier than open violence would have been. It was the tension of arithmetic deciding who mattered. That month a strange thing began to happen on the edge of town. Weak cattle drifted into Black River itself. Not in a thundering drive, not in dramatic numbers, but singly and in 2s and 3s. They came down from the range and stood near shed stockyards and the freight platform, drawn by the smell of feed they could not reach. Some nosed at planks. 1 old cow licked spilled grain from between wagon ruts. A gaunt steer stood for half a day beside the livery stable, too tired even to be driven off. The sight disturbed people more deeply than they admitted. Starvation on the distant range was one kind of fact. Starvation standing silently in the street was another. Wolves came closer to Dot at first. They were seen only at dusk, crossing fence lines or showing as moving shadows near the creek bottoms. Then riders reported them following weakened herds openly. By mid-January, their tracks were found near the edge of town. The wolves were not the cause of the disaster, only its inheritors. Still, they gave the winter a primitive cruelty that no ledger could soften. In February, the death among men began. A boy named Eli Broom, 17 years old and assigned to a chuck wagon crew on one of the smaller spreads, disappeared while searching for strayed saddle horses after a night blow. They found him 2 days later in a drifted swale less than 3 miles from camp. He had curled behind a fallen cottonwood and used his coat to shield his face, but the cold took him before dawn. Another rider, Peter Latt, went out to inspect the southern wire after reports of a packed herd, and returned with both hands so badly frozen that the doctor, after 3 days of waiting for the line between life and death to declare itself, removed half of one and most fingers from the other. The doctor said little during the operation. Men who had seen war said afterward that the quiet of that room was worse than noise. Haynes continued trying to hold the company together. He wrote, he calculated, he revised projections. He sent messages east requesting emergency feed purchases, bridge loans, shipment adjustments. But something in him was beginning to fail, and those near him saw it before he did. His collars were no longer always clean. He forgot names. He rode less often. The certainty in his speech thinned into insistence. And insistence is often certainty after it has started to die. One afternoon, Creed came into the office and found Haynes sitting alone over a spread of figures. The room was warm from the stove, but Haynes had not taken off his gloves. How many? Haynes asked without looking up. Creed leaned against the doorjamb. Enough that tells me nothing. It tells you what matters. Haynes raised his eyes then. They were tired in a way Creed had not seen before. I need numbers. No, Creed said. You need forgiveness from numbers. That's not the same thing. Haynes stared at him, and for a moment Creed thought the younger man might flare up in anger. Instead he looked back, down at the papers. I built this operation to survive a bad year. Creed answered him after a pause. Built it to survive the kind of bad year men can imagine in offices. The remark was cruel, though not intentionally so. It was simply true. And winter has a habit of stripping away all the gentler disguises people use around truth. By early March, the weather softened enough for the first real thaw to begin. This should have felt like mercy. In many places it did not. When snow retreats after a catastrophic winter, it does not reveal recovery. It reveals an account. The first bodies appeared in the obvious places, near gate corners, along heavy wire, in low draws where the drifts had preserved them almost whole. Then more emerged, in creek beds, around stock tanks, at the lee side of ridges, in ravines where cattle had piled in under storm pressure and smothered one another. Along one western line there was a stretch, nearly half a mile long, where the dead lay so thickly at the fence that men had to dismantle the wire to clear them. The smell came with the sun. It rose heavy and sweet and foul, moved by the warming air across all the southern approaches to town. Ravens gathered first, hopping with obscene confidence among the carcasses. Then came the coyotes and wolves. Men who had spent the whole winter talking in numbers stopped talking much at all. The losses were beyond anything Black River had imagined. On some places a third of the herd remained, on others less than a quarter. A few independent stockmen were nearly wiped out. Northern Prairie lost not only cattle but horses, feed reserves, equipment, labor, and the confidence of its investors. The company's books, which had once looked like maps of progress, now looked like the record of a slow strangulation. Spring on the plains can be viciously beautiful after a hard winter. That year was no exception. The sky grew larger by the day. Meltwater flashed in the creek channels. The first green at the bottoms appeared with almost indecent freshness. It was that beauty, perhaps, that made the wreckage harder to bear. Nature had resumed itself with no trace of apology. Men, by contrast, could not recover so quickly from the shame of having misunderstood the country so thoroughly. The bank in Black River failed in May. Its closing was handled as decently as possible. There was no dramatic run, no theatrical crash of panic. The banker simply announced a temporary suspension, then admitted 2 days later that there would be no reopening unless support came from farther east. Support did not come. A place that had seemed solid became all at once a shell. Deposits vanished into legal phrases. Credit vanished into memory. After that, departures began. A hotel loses its dignity quickly when there are no traveling buyers and no cattle contracts to negotiate. The dining room emptied first, then the upstairs rooms. The saloon remained open longer, but it grew quieter instead of rowdier. Men drank not in celebration or swagger, but in the dull manner of people trying to soften the edges of a failure too large to narrate. Families loaded wagons. A widow with 2 boys left for relatives in Iowa. A blacksmith took down his sign and shipped his tools by rail. One of the company bookkeepers disappeared without notice. leaving only a trunk of worthless papers and a pair of city shoes. Haynes stayed longer than many expected him to. Perhaps pride kept him, perhaps guilt, perhaps the simple fact that there was nowhere east he wished to explain himself. He walked the streets more than he had during his prosperous year, and several people were struck by how much older he looked. Disaster ages some men by stripping them. It ages others by forcing them for the first time to see clearly. Haynes belonged to the second kind. One afternoon in June he found Creed near the wire warehouse. The coils inside were rusting lightly where moisture had settled on them. The sight was almost symbolic beyond endurance, miles of future waiting uselessly under a roof. I was wrong, Haynes said. Creed did not answer at once. He had no interest in humiliating him. Yes, he said. Finally, Haynes let out a breath that might have been a laugh if there had been any humor in it. You could say it with less satisfaction. There isn't any satisfaction in it. They stood a while looking out over the yards toward the open country. What happens now? Haynes asked. Creed narrowed his eyes at the south wind. Now the land teaches slower. That's all. That isn't much of an answer. It's the only one the plains ever give. Summer returned, but Black River was not the same town that had welcomed it the year before. Many buildings still stood. The church still held services. The depot still took freight. Yet the moral shape of the place had changed. Confidence had gone out of it. Men spoke more softly. They no longer said control so is. No one with sense talked about limitless carrying capacity. Even the younger riders, those who had once mocked every warning as old man talk, had learned to look at fences with something like suspicion. As for Haynes, stories later diverged. Some said he returned east before autumn and never again involved himself in cattle. Others claimed he remained somewhere on a smaller spread, managing modest stock with the care of a chastened man. The West is full of half-true endings, and perhaps that one deserves to remain uncertain. Creed lived on several more years and endured more winters, though none as destructive as that one. Men continued to ask his opinion every season despite pretending not to need it. Whenever younger owners began speaking too boldly about permanent systems and total management, he would look north and say something brief enough to sound like irritation but deep enough to survive them. The plains do not hate you, he once said. That's what fools forget. If they hated men, none would remain. They simply do not care how much you've invested. Long after the crisis passed, travelers moving through that country reported hearing a faint metallic hum from old fence lines on damp evenings. When the wind pulled across them at the right angle, most took it for what it was in the mechanical sense. Wire under tension, singing in weather. Those who had lived through the winter of 1888 heard something more in it. Not a ghost, not a curse, not superstition, a memory. The memory of a town that had tried to outlast the plains by organizing them. The memory of men who believed paper could overrule distance, weather, hunger, and fear. The memory of dead cattle lined in drifts where movement had been stopped by improvement. The memory of a season that broke not just herds and banks, but a certain kind of arrogance, and if the sound lingered in the mind after a man rode past, it was because the lesson itself lingered. You could ship wire west. You could drive posts. You could divide a horizon. You could borrow against grass, not yet grown. You could map water, count stock, fence creeks, project returns, and write confident letters to men who had never felt a northern wind cut through a coat at dusk. You could do all of that, and still the plains would remain what they had always been, wider than intention, older than ambition, and patient enough to let men mistake temporary success for mastery. That was the real ruin of Black River. Not merely that it lost money, not merely that cattle died, not even that people left it, was that for one bright and profitable year, the town had believed itself modern enough to be exempt from the oldest law of the country. Nothing on the plains survives long by forgetting movement. And nothing human survives there long by confusing possession with understanding.